Thank you very much, Lara and Stefan, for being with us today to present your book for the Collectif de Pantin. It's entitled Psychanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine. Let me briefly introduce you. So you're both academics in the United States. Lara Sheehi is assistant professor of clinical psychology at George Washington University. And Stefan Sheehi is professor of Middle East Studies and director of Decolonizing Humanities Project at William and Mary. Your book could be discussed from different angles. We will focus today mainly on how psychoanalysis is engaged and challenged in Palestine. I would like to begin by situating your book within a tradition, the one opened by Fanon in the early 50s, and which has since given rise to various studies such as critical race studies, post-colonial and decolonial studies. This tradition has explicitly politicized the use of psychiatry, clinical psychology, and psychoanalysis, opening up the critical possibility of thinking about political subjectivation in contexts of multiple and intersecting dominations. If this book can, in my opinion, be qualified as Fanonian, it is not because Fanon remains an unavoidable theoretical reference, which you use in your book, but because it does not leave the reader untouched by the problems that it deals with, and because it includes her or him in the construction of a possible common horizon by obliging the reader to recognize that he or she is a part of the violence that is being exposed, denounced, and fought against. And if one cannot read your book without being modified by its concerns, it is probably because it found its inspiration in what you call in the foreword a revolutionary love, by which you are connected both and which supported the elaboration of this book. Could you begin by telling us what revolutionary love is for you and how it is linked to your commitment for and research in Palestine, and if it is linked to the clarification of the complex position that psychoanalysis occupies there?
Yeah, I love that question a lot. First of all, thank you so much for having us. And, you know, part of revolutionary love, I think, for me, is an unbending solidarity that undergirds, right? That solidarity, love undergirds solidarity across situations. And so I want to start off by speaking unbending love and solidarity to the peoples whose occupied land we are currently on, which is the Massachusetts people we're bringing in from settler colonial United States. And that's not a pedantic position, right? It's a position that locates us. And I think for me, what revolutionary love is an insistence on not disavowing the forces that create the conditions of oppression today, and to not be afraid of that. Because if revolutionary love is always guiding us in terms of dismantling oppressive positions to imagine the world we want to live in, right? That marking these realities without succumbing or being seduced by disavowals that would have us live in a world and forget that this is occupied land here or in Palestine, betrays what revolutionary love does. It grounds you, it stays you, it connects you to an unbending reality testing. That's where Fanon comes in, right? Is that this unwillingness to bend. Every time I read Fanon, I'm struck by the revolutionary love in his words, because there's this, I mean, he doesn't let up. He doesn't let you take a breath about the violence that is all around. And for me, the balm for that, the thing that allows us to keep going without feeling demoralized, is the binding of revolutionary love, right? Now, how that connects to Palestine is that's sort of what positions us in this as Lebanese Arabs. This is a huge part of our work with Palestine, again, a refusal of the partition that partitioned our countries, whether it's Lebanon and Palestine, that insists on separating us, that insists on making our struggles different, even though if we're sort of looking at revolutionary love and what our ancestors have laid before us about what it looks like for people to come together against a structure of oppression or the logics of oppression, that's what binds us to Palestine. I think this is what sort of made this book in many ways a work of love. It's a love letter to Palestine. It's a love letter to freedom fighters. It's a love letter to everybody who is fighting in solidarity for the world that hopefully as revolutionaries we all want to create, right? And that's the sort of philosophical end to it. There's nitty gritty that comes to it, but I'll speak the romantic philosophy and then I can hand it off to you.
It's a hard one to follow. I'm just going to, I think Lara touched on it a lot, and I also want to thank both of you for your time and your commitment to social justice in general, but also Palestine. So I appreciate that. And just briefly said, I think, my first encounter with the concept of revolutionary love, of course, comes from Che Guevara. And I just want to say, to build on what Lara says, to think about, we try to live our lives in, as Laurent Berlant says, that we want to live our lives in the relations of the world that we want.
Yeah.
Right. We want to replicate the world that we want in our daily life. Right. So revolutionary love for me means forging social relations that are all mediated by capitalism, colonialism, racism, cis heteronormativity, for us to build our social relations against those and despite those, and in hopes of destroying those, but also in the process of building something more beautiful, the world that we want to live in. So it's to build through revolutionary love a world that we want now. So I think that is revolutionary love to me, to love our collective selves, right? Despite racism and colonialism and all that is negated, cis heteronormativity. And so that undergirds all of our work. And in terms of love, in revolutionary love, then with Palestine, as Lebanese, as Lara said, is to engage in a world where we understand, outside of necessarily it's sort of a doctrinal Arab nationalist sort of paradigm, to understand how we are all subjects of a colonial violence that was enacted with Sykes-Picot, right? So our connecting with our Palestinian siblings is us reenacting and reestablishing those relations that are in us. Just like Ilyes, I don't know your history, but that's we are now connecting with our history that was somehow disrupted by racial capitalism and colonialism.
Right. And that forced to atomize us. And it's a constant. I think revolutionary love also is working against atomization, is working against alienation constantly to make these connections and social relations in spite of oppressive forces. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Thank you. And how does psychoanalysis fit in that, doesn't fit, actually, in that revolutionary love? In other words, I mean, could you tell us a little bit the story of this book, where it comes from for you, how it was born in your spirit first, and then and in your political mind, and preoccupations, and how you built it?
Yeah, I love that, how it was born in our spirit. What a beautiful way to say it.
I love that.
And something I think English can't capture, by the way. So I hope I can do justice to it. But I think that do I think that psychoanalysis can inhabit a revolutionary love? Yes, if we are reimagine and constantly reimagine, because part of that is, you know, part of the reimagining is also not succumbing to a static position that, and I think in many ways, psychoanalysis promises that. It promises fluidity. It promises that part of the ask of psychoanalysis is a continuous critical self-occupation and insistence on sort of reworking the things that look natural and organic, whether it's in the collective or in the individual. Do I think that's what it's cashed out on? No. Yeah. And I think in many ways, that is how it came into our spirit. Because what we were confronted with was a particular promise of a theory that has been used towards radical aims for a long time. Yeah. And we don't ascribe to this thing of like psychoanalysis is done in Europe and the United States, but not in other spaces. Yeah, right? Yeah. To the contrary, that again, Fanon and others have shown us this, nor do we ascribe to a purist model of what psychoanalysis is and who practices psychoanalysis and who doesn't belong there. But if what we're confronted with constantly, and this is what came out of the book, is particularly me as a psychoanalytic clinician, not a psychoanalyst for these reasons, right? Yeah. I refuse to be trained in institutes that can't cash out on their promise of their theory, even though they hold it so dear, right? They feel like it's a noble practice. Yeah. But we would go to these conferences, or I would go to these conferences, and I would come back and be like, there's something happening in psychoanalysis that's like absurd, because people believe in the unconscious, and then all of a sudden when you say Palestine, there is no unconscious. It's just everything collapses, right? Everything is just, and this annihilatory anxiety takes over, and people can't reach into their theory anymore in ways that doesn't happen with other things, right? That's not to say psychoanalysis is not racist, is not sexist, but there's something really curious that happened with Palestine. The second you spoke the word Palestine, something else happened, and you felt that shift. And part of it was being an Arab woman in the room that was really attuned to this shift and feeling viscerally and affectively what was happening, even though everybody might insist to me this is not happening, right? When you embody it, again, a Fanonian embodiment of it, there's no way not to feel it, and there's no way not to feel it's about to come even before it does, right? So, for example, being at a conference and having a man walk into the room, the talk was called Talking About Palestine in Psychoanalysis. That's it. And a man walking and blocking the door and wearing an Israeli shirt, wrapping himself up in an Israeli flag kufiye, and screaming for an hour, disrupting us, looking at me, cracking his knuckles, flexing his muscles. And rather than people, those of us who are activists would be like, you disrupt that right away. You make that person leave the room because he's aggressing on the space. The analyst in the room starting to analyze what was happening as an enactment. And I'm like, an enactment is unconscious. This is an aggression, and it comes from a long history of Zionist displacement of what is happening because you're threatened by the mere word of Palestine. So I would come home and tell him, this just happened. This particular one, he was on the way to the conference. So I called him. I'm like, can you believe this just happened? And him being like, what is psychoanalysis like in the 1980s? That's really, I mean, that's what we were confronted with. We were confronted with what is happening, particularly in psychoanalysis, because it makes a claim. It makes a political claim. It makes a claim to a universal. That's not to say it doesn't happen in other fields, but when you as a field and as a theory and as a practice make a particular claim in terms of what you can do and how much better you are than other things, then you have a higher responsibility to answer to these collapses that happen. And I think that's where we were like, okay, revolutionary love, wonderful. I can look at all the you know, wonderful people in psychoanalysis have fought. And then there's this thing that keeps happening. What's going on there?
Yeah.
Reactionary hate.
Exactly.
So that was actually the basis of your book. That's where you started from to write this book.
To think through together.
I think part of it was that, and the other part was, you know, that just to kind of wrap around the first part of that question to this one was, you know, when you think about theory, and now we're talking to French and the French audience, and you know, this is the epicenter of theory, right? When you think about theory,
or should be, I'm not sure it still is, but you
right,
know,
they like to think themselves, and everybody in the world does. So
okay.
and so, you know, for me as a racialized brown, you know, Arab American, coming upon Marx and coming upon Lacan, I came to Freud through Lacan, right? And you see the revolutionary potential in this work, right? You see it. It denudes so much for you, right? But then what everyone, you get to a point where in my life, there's a 1968, you know, moment where, like, you know, that somehow this all these revolutionary theorists aren't with the students in the street. Right? And that's what Palestine is. Right? It's a constant state of all these revolutionary theorists running away from the students and the workers in the street. Right? So I think psychoanalysis, for me, at one level, because Palestine is so important, it was an inevitable barricade that we had to confront. Psychoanalysis has had a fine time with Palestine and the Palestine-Israeli conflict, of course, because, you know, everyone loves psychoanalyzing Palestinians. And if they're the liberals, they want to psychoanalyze the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. You know, and everyone, it's their trauma and and that's where it's incredibly frustrating and insulting and colonialist and imperialist, and it's exactly the worst possible things about psychoanalysis. Right? To talk about it's all because someone's father was killed or not killed, right? And I think that's also where we walk into this, where we don't kind of care about psychoanalysis as an institution, but just see it as a practice and how it is being operationalized on the ground.
Right.
So that's how, and so we want to recenter Palestinians in psychoanalysis, not the conflict, not this grand theory, not the edible father, you know, where are Palestinians centered in this discussion of psychoanalysis.
And the final leg of it, so it's multi-layered how we came to this, right? It was what was happening in the moment. It's this sort of analysis that you're giving. And the final leg goes back to the question of revolutionary love, of like, if we are talking about aligning ourselves in every way with the world we want to see, he and I together were like, we have been fighting for the liberation of Palestine our whole respective lives. And so this idea of aligning also our academic practice and my clinical practice and academic with that so there is no separation between what we do as clinicians and academics and activism, so that we're not those theorists
who turn away from students and workers in the streets.
Exactly.
Okay. So, and can you tell us a little bit more about how you built your clinical field in Palestine? I mean, because it's quite different to be committed to the Palestinian people politically and to have access to, you know, the clinical practice there. So can you tell us a little bit how you built this connection with clinicians there?
Do you want me to? So, well, the first stage was, you know, just trying to find out who practices in general, and obviously who is more sort of, let's say, psychodynamic in their practice. And then, you know, I initially went there, stayed for 4 or 5 months, and then Lara and I would go back, and I think we've said in the past that, you know, we have this whole list of sort of academic questions, right? And none of them become relevant in as you talk, right? So, you know, and it's absurd. So the way we sort of built the practice, I think this is where I myself, who has been, I was a cultural theorist, and, you know, maybe you could think of it as a cultural historian, very textually based, very not sort of anthropologically based or, you know, ethnographically based, had to relearn a methodology. And I think we developed and learned from folks who engage in a decolonial feminist methodology, where you allow the content to emerge from the conversations. You listen to the people who you are talking to and let them guide you about what their priorities are. You build relationships that are lasting relationships. You ensure that these relationships are not extractive, that I'm not going to go there, study you and leave and you never see me again, that we contribute. So often we would try to come back and we'll go to Palestine, and as we go to Palestine, we do something there, collaborative with these folks. And every time we would go to Palestine, we would meet more people. And then we would bring more people to things that we're doing. And then there you're building a community. And it became a very organic process where we go back and look at these silly questions that we read, you know, like, you know, oh, do you like Lacan or you win a cup? And it came out quite organically, and through doing that, you know, it's not one of always coherence, right? Or it's not, you know, there's dissensus, as Rancière says, right? There's, you know, there's a lot of contradiction and conflict and tension, and you work through those things, and you learn from those things, and sometimes things don't always end up beautifully, but you are building something in the process, and you always are there with an open heart in order to gain the trust of folks, and you always actually deprioritize your project.
Right.
Right? Because you're learning through this process. You deprioritize what you want. And in doing that, you're building something. I think that's the way we connected with folks.
Right.
You know, you build trust and you earn trust and you commit to them, even when the project has ended.
And it really was solidarity community building, because this idea of like every time we went down, we'd meet somebody new. It was because the people we met the time before would be like, you need to meet this person, right? And like organizing, whether it's labor or community organizing, they vouched for us, right? And so in many ways, the starting point is, you know, you had said it's one thing to sort of be committed to the cause of Palestine, it's another thing to have access to these spaces. You're absolutely right. And also the starting point has to be the commitment to Palestinian liberation, because I think that is part of it. And we might see this as well, of course, but the stories and the examples we have of psychologists and psychoanalysts going into Palestine, right? And being very wishy-washy about their solidarity with that, or like you're saying, having a foreclosed notion of what they want out of their project, right? I want to look at peace. I want dialogue. All of these projects have an endpoint that works away from a decolonial method of something emerging, right? And I think people on the ground, because there's so little separation of clinic and street when you're fighting for liberation, they get a sense of that too. And so every time we would go back, we would meet somebody new because somebody vouched for us. And somebody said, you haven't yet met Lara and Stephen, and you come to this, or would you be willing to go do a training here? The centerpiece of that was Arabic. Truly became a political statement and a political necessity and a political imperative to do these things in Arabic. And let me tell you, for people, we were just talking about being colonized by English. For people, you know, an Arab American born and raised in
you both speak Arabic. I mean, you were raised in Arab, right?
Yeah.
It's your native.
I was not raised an Arab speaker. I learned,
right.
You learned it afterward.
Yes.
Okay. There's hope, Elias.
Yes. And I was born and raised in Arabic, but still, when you come to the United States, and you're sort of raised in a particular way, in a particular register, Arabic is stolen from you, because whether it's the authenticity of academic language or how you think or the way you're socialized. And so, you know, when we say we spoke Arabic, this was not an easy thing. And
I can. That's why I intervened, because I can imagine that it's not that easy.
It's not
even though necessary. I can totally imagine it's necessary to build a transference, a work. I mean, you know, a transference for work, and but it's not that easy.
Yes, and a commitment. I think people, you know, to learn clinical language in Arabic. Into a training, right? I mean, we speak Arabic every day. We understand everything. That's not the problem. The problem is speaking in a clinical register, speaking to folks with different dialects, coming in and doing a 45-minute talk in Arabic is very different than speaking to your family in Arabic.
We'll talk about counter-transference in Arabic.
Exactly. So
your grandmother.
But that struggle, I think, is part of it, right? The struggle of saying, okay, we see the political necessity in this. And this is, I think, what did set us apart. The vouching piece is that because of the settler colonial condition in Palestine, what often people relied on were either good Israelis who would train people in English, so we needed translation, or it reduced access of who could go and who couldn't. Or you had people from the United States or from elsewhere who come in, sometimes luminaries who are, you know, pro-Palestinian, or at least think Palestinians are humans, right? To come in and train in English. So you kind of also disrupted this reliance on a different register, right? And there's something really, for me, life-changing about that. About embodying what it meant to be on the ground every day and use the language. And then also, this is where being Lebanese really did come in.
And can I just add one thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
You know, it's important to note that most of the clinicians in Palestine actually speak English.
Excellent.
Very well.
We understand that in your book, actually. So it's a political, it's even more a political gesture to speak Arabic with them and not English.
They are very intentional also. They
about
are
speaking
Arabic.
Right.
And they're not forcing it on us, because they would speak if we wanted to English, but they amongst themselves. So I think, like, it's not necessarily disruptive always. I understand what you're saying about the disruptive piece.
No, to me, also, as a Lebanese.
But it's also like a very constructive part of that. And I think that's the point about coming from abroad, being a Lebanese who has this colonially imposed border put between you, and being able to walk into that and refuse to speak English, even though I may make quite a few errors in Arabic, right? And learning. So I think it's important.
The disruption that I was referring to is a disruption of a colonial logic, that somehow being trained in English is more superior, because we know that this is the way that it gets talked about, right? Or that you have a particular valence towards English, or in the context of settler colonial condition of Hebrew. All of that language becomes really packed up in that. The other part was the disruption of the colonial borders. To have us as Lebanese come in and speak with a Lebanese dialect too, of Arabic. What people's response to that was really so moving.
What was the response to that?
So to be in spaces in clinical, and when we would be in these spaces that we were invited to, that we collaborated together, it wasn't just clinicians who were there, community people. I mean, because there's a in this, and this is, I'm marking this because in the United States, it's so different. They're so siloed off, but in other spaces in the world, we know that people are involved in these debates and these issues, whether or not they're clinicians, right? People come in, there's this layperson mentality. People come in and engage in these issues, but we'd be in these spaces, and whether it's a training or a talk or that people would invite us into, and the affect in the room.
Yeah.
When we spoke with a Lebanese Arabic.
And the Lebanese Arabic is understandable by Palestinian people easily?
Yes, it's because it's an accent rather than anything else.
Okay.
Right, it's not a... So people would come up to us afterwards and, 70-year-old men, and just be in tears and say, I can't believe there's a Lebanese person standing in front of me here, and it's not on TV. I'm hearing you speak in real life in front of me, talking, Arabic, and you as a Lebanese person being here with me, because we thought you all had forgotten about us, right? That sort of, I don't think there's anything that could capture the power in that, talk about relational, right, building, to capture that from younger folks to 70, 80-year-old men, sort of having this analysis, this social political analysis of the moment, of like, when I hear you, I remember the time when this border was not a border. We actually had somebody tell us that. Right?
Could you move from there to a very important point you make in your book, which is psychoanalytic innocence? Because it seems to me that it's related to that, to the fact that you felt it was necessary to speak Arabic with Palestinian people, and disrupt this facility to speak in English, because everyone does, and they were trained in English, and so you could have done that. But it seems to me it's a way to break up with psychoanalytic innocence, to speak Arabic there, and open up other spaces than the ones that are possible with the hegemonic language.
Yeah. Yes. Do you want me to go, or you first?
I think the thing, psychoanalytic innocence comes out of earlier work by other, we can call them critical race theorists in North America, and thinking about how whiteness operates in theory.
Yeah.
Right? And I know in France, the configuration is a bit different, even though it's an incredibly racist country that they pretend it's not racist. But totally. And partially the Americans allow that to happen because the United States is a racially constructed country. France is a colonial constructed country. So there are two different kinds of imperialism that we're talking about. So that's where psychoanalytic innocence comes from. And I think it's effectively a way in which psychoanalysis is able to run back into, and as you said, there's the hegemonic language, to shore up particular forms of racial and colonial hegemony.
Yeah.
Right. But by doing that, but doing that through the liberal claims of humanism.
Yeah.
In other words, and this is where Fanon comes in, using the human to bludgeon the non-human, right? And the non-human is those who dare challenge the sanctity and the principles of colonial hegemony and white hegemony.
Yeah. And
colonial hegemony and white hegemony, not when it's talking about itself as colonial hegemony and white hegemony, because that's like Le Pen and all the fascists. They're cool. They'll just say it, right? But it's the Macrons of the world who talk about liberalism and these sorts of things. When you refuse, the psychoanalytic innocence is that defensive structure that refuses to acknowledge itself as the Le Penist, right? No, we're different, and it's to maintain the innocence, right? Laïcité as some sort of innocent formation because we really, really value everyone. No, laïcité in France is a means to control racial minorities and religious minorities. We know this, right? So the retreat into laïcité is a mechanism in France, a French mechanism of white innocence,
Yeah.
It's French in a sense. It's right? And so I think that's the parallel within how you have a lot of good psychoanalysts who care about, brown people, but it's always couched really in a compulsion to save the supremacy of a self that is really a guise for a white self, a colonial self, a male self, a heteronormative self.
Right.
So I think that's
and I think it's these theorists, if what they all have in common, whether it's Gloria Wekker talking about white innocence in Dutch sort of colonial white innocence, or Shirin Dazat and Fellows talking about the race to innocence, or Yves Yang talking about settler colonial innocence, that if we bring all these together and then locate it within psychoanalysis, we can talk about sort of innocence maintained consciously, not just unconsciously. There's a conscience maintenance of what appears to be like ideology, organic categories of dominance, right? In the context of Palestine, why psychoanalytic insidious is particularly insidious in Palestine is that it ends up prioritizing concepts like dialogue, like reason, like civility, as precursors to humanness, right? And so what ends up happening is if you refuse those as a political position, you are pathologized immediately as not being within the category of subjectivity that can be saved, right? We've seen this before, like who's analyzable, who's not, all these sorts of things. But also psychoanalytic innocence insists on what we might call sort of a defanged victimhood that doesn't have political specificity, right? We saw this just actually play out with UNRWA, with the UNRWA, the UN sort of
Relief Work Association. It's the one that it's
Palestine
that takes care of the Palestine.
And we saw this, and we can sort of see the parallel that happens in psychoanalytic innocence is that they caved under sort of US pressure to say, okay, Palestinians are able to have these resources if they also don't refer to themselves as Palestinians. Right. And so that's what psychoanalytic innocence also insists on, that you are allowed into humanity, allowed into our sort of
you should disavow yourself.
Correct. Worthiness of us to sort of locate you as a psychoanalytic subject, as somebody who has a potential for health and wellness, as somebody who could maybe one day reach a good, healthy, intact ego, right? If you leave your political specificity behind, and if you ascribe to a particular type of trauma that's legible to psychoanalysis, and that at the same time doesn't disrupt psychoanalysis in any way. And that's like where the parallel to white innocence comes in, right? Is that you can talk progressive, words all day long, and psychoanalysis can take up race and gender and all that. But if you are not disrupting any particular set of logics within which psychoanalysis is inscribed, right, in the same discourses, then what are you doing? I mean, and that's what innocence is you say you're doing something, but you're consistently insisting on not showing everything that you're doing to shore up a particular type of normativity.
So that leads us to geopolitics of psychoanalysis, which I thought as being our last part, but there was a different path of the discussion than I thought, which is very good. And so if it comes also from another interview you had, and it raised a question for me, which is, what does it change then for geopolitics of psychoanalysis to seriously consider the Palestinian situation? What does it change for the political position worldly of psychoanalysis, and also what does it change for psychoanalysis itself? I mean, how does it twist the concepts and the ways we practice psychoanalysis to consider this seriously and not forgetting about it as soon as possible, which is the easiest way to consider it. So
yes. Yes.
Yeah.
I know it's a big question.
Well, just, if you can just.
It's great. It's a fantastic, I'm excited about it.
I'm not an analyst,
Okay.
so it's hard for me to answer these questions. I'll be very, very brief. And because again, the way I handle psychoanalytic theory, it can't be separated from, Marxist theory or the theory of racial capitalism or racial capitalism. So to think about psychoanalysis, the question is this, is if we think about psychoanalysis in play in Palestine, it will allow us to think about psychoanalysis in play in other parts of the world where settler colonialism is at play, or with other racial capitalisms at play, or where eco-destruction is at play, or where cis-heteronormativity is at play. So how is it that we can start to think not about psychoanalysis as a practice, but as an emancipatory theory?
Yeah, exactly.
How can it is, and when you think about it, it is not about saving the self in front of you. It's about it's about affirming that self, but not affirming that self as individual, but affirming that self who is subjected to a regime of violence.
Yeah.
And that violence is capitalism. If it's just this, white cis heteronormative dude, that also is capitalism. Capitalism is a part of that. So how is it that we can think about psychoanalysis not as an objective practice, not as something to attend to the individual psyche only, but to understand how that's always linked to larger social structures of domination, and how psychoanalysis itself has to be an emancipatory project in a collective struggle to dismantle those oppressive structures, but also in creating, going back to revolutionary love, and creating the kind of world that we all want to live in, where you don't, hopefully you'll be seeing less and less patients.
Yeah, exactly. I call it committing professional suicide. We should all be like, for getting rid of psychoanalysis altogether, because we're, freeing ourselves up of all the oppressive structures that make it necessary to begin with.
Yeah, it's very hopeful to think that alienation could disappear. Yeah, with capitalism, it could maybe, and racial capitalism, but it has a strong power to survive to many, many things. So it's good to see that you're hopeful that we will overcome this structural alienation of ours.
Yeah.
No, and again, we all read Foucault as well, right? So we're not talking about, repression is a dynamic thing. I mean, this is what happens, and power is a dynamic. It also, but hopefully also, when psychoanalysis stops being a narcissist and starts to be part of a larger collective struggle, it will allow us also to constantly always confront power structures that always run. Think about repression and think about how liberatory practices can be repressive. Okay, liberatory practices can be repressive. We get it. But you know what? Right now, resistance against oppression is resistance against oppression. We'll worry about those secondary ones. The women's movement, let's crush patriarchy first, and then we can think about also what are those new power structures that emerge or that allow. That's I mean, maybe psychoanalysis is well tuned to allow us to keep unfolding this process of not to be a Maoist, a continuous revolution, right?
Or maybe not. And I think but the question has to be there. And I think right now it feels like a fortress that sort of is very cyclical and internal and doesn't take up a lot of auto critique, right? I mean, and this is my position as a clinician. When you ask the question of what does it do when we geopolitically sort of take up the question of Palestine and psychoanalysis, what does it do to psychoanalysis, right?
Yeah.
For me, as somebody who is committed to if I am going to be part of psychoanalysis, my ethical commitment is to be the one who is critiquing psychoanalysis the most, because that is my way of resisting our complicity and the ways, if we understand psychoanalysis, we understand how people become complicit and how people sort of get seduced into normativity. And like, if we understand that, then Palestine must be a central question, because we see the disruption that Palestine does. And when it does that, it tells us there's something here, if we're going to use psychoanalytic language, that is hiding unconsciously, that sells itself as part of the fixtures, right? That are not unconscious. It sells itself as organic, because this disruption, this level of disruption couldn't continue to happen if there wasn't something else embedded ideologically and so Palestine becomes the question that, to me, gets the quickest to the ideological basis of psychoanalysis. And that's what it does. The other thing is that I talked about being very serious about psychoanalysis cashing out on its promise, right? And for me, there's a technical problem that comes up consistently when we can't metabolize questions of settler colonialism or people's right to self-determination, or, borrowing from Fanon, the question of violence. There's something technical that goes on, because we're not separate. You are telling me as an analyst, and this is happening right now on the listserv, on the American Psychoanalytic listserv. And analysts from all over the place, but especially from the United States, are having this debate that honestly feels it could be crazy making if my politics weren't so clear. Right?
What is the debate?
I mean, the second you say Palestine, it just, everything falls apart. And then this is what you're talking about, the collective. And individuals start to talk as though they are speaking about a systemic analysis. Or they talk about history without an analysis of capital, of settler colonialism, and then it becomes taken as as reality. And then the disavowal continues to happen. I mean, the level of disavowal that has to happen on a daily basis for us in this current moment to say that Israel is not a settler colonial situation or an apartheid state is, for me, mind-boggling as somebody who's psychoanalytic watching this unfold.
But it's a weird timing, because at the same moment, Palestine, the situation, the Palestinian situation, is recognized officially as an apartheid situation. So it's really contradictory.
Exactly. But and so we can't even do that. The liberal sort of, we were saying, if the liberal mainstream organization like Amnesty International is saying this, you still cannot address this. But we say this emerged from a conversation about Ukraine and Russia. And that's what the Palestinian question, really, what you're saying, what does this do for us, is that you see immediately when Ukraine and Russia come onto the scene, for any of us that are engaged is not a surprise, right? But what emerges is immediately non-complexity in terms of your ability to see what's happening, your ability to understand the importance of the boycott, your ability to mobilize into action, your ability to see a Molotov cocktail as a potential thing to free oneself. Immediately. And that's, I think, what psychoanalysis is, to have this ability to sort of read a situation and say, how is it that these contradictions exist in the same place? There's no separation between the conversation about Ukraine and Russia and then immediately an email that says Palestine. And all of a sudden, your position that once was is immediately diametrically opposed. And worse, you are demonizing Palestinians who are doing the exact same thing. There's a question of identification there, of course, white supremacy. There's all these things that psychoanalysis gives us the language for. And that's what I mean about a technical. We have a technical problem. When the second Palestine is mentioned, all of your techniques and your theoretical basis is vacated of its coherence. Because you're no longer analysts. If you really, and I'm cool with that, you don't want to be an analyst, fine, but when it so quickly morphs, and you can't even hold on to the coherence of the theory, there's something larger happening. And I think that's what happens when we, and that's why for me, it's an ethical issue to center Palestine in these discussions, because if we are committed as clinicians to the alleviation of suffering, not on the individual intrapsychic level, but on a truly revolutionary imagination of what the world can look like free of oppressive forces, then we must be with the Palestinian solidarity struggle.
Thank you very much. Maybe to go back to a more clinical level, what is very original in your book also, that a lot to say about your books. It's so rich that I choose my way in the possibilities you offer. What interested me a lot is the fact that multiple clinical practices coexist and interact. And could you, because there is not only psychoanalysis as a clinical practice in Palestine, and I was very interested to learn more about how the different practitioners, clinicians, coexist and have to coexist in that situation. I mean, in comparison here, I mean, in France, of course, there are also many different schools and orientations in the clinic, but we don't have to mix up. I mean, everyone is on his own race, right? And does what it wants to enlarge the vision within its own orientation. And this is not, I think this is not possible in Palestine, because clinical situations are such that people have to dialogue and to coexist with different perspectives, but have to find a way to a common language, as you said. Could you let us know a little bit more about that? How you feel that it changes practices of psychoanalysts also, because they have to take into account other ways of seeing things.
Yeah.
Joanna, should I?
Do you have something?
I have something.
Okay, go for it then. I'll have my turn.
I always like listening to you rather than listening to you. So at one level, we want to de-exclusivize Palestine, because Palestine exists like any other country. And our argument, actually, there is a Palestine, and that Palestine exists from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River. Right? Yeah. And it is a unified space. Despite this apartheid system that is intent on fragmenting the Palestinian people. So Palestinians suffer from any Palestinian society, suffers from any, all the same sort of developmental problems that any other developing society would, right? They have traffic, and all that sort of, right? They need clinics, they need revenue, and so that is, we want to de-exclusivize that. I think what you say is important, because at one level, we don't want to romanticize the Palestinian clinical community. It is diverse, and not everyone likes each other. But why should they? Why would we task the Palestinians with a responsibility that no one has? That no, right? The Lebanese don't like each other, right? So, I would say that so it's important to note also that in terms of analysts, there are maybe one or two in all of Palestine. Okay. And that person, I think one or two of them are Lacanians. So they're not even, they would go through the Lacanian track, which we also know has its own relationship with other International Psychanalytic Association type things. Okay. So now the relationship of that analyst, obviously they have some cachet. There's a lot of politics that are involved. For us, I think as you're talking, I'm thinking about the Palestinian priority is not to overcome the siloing of Palestinian psychoanalytic sectarianism.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That the Jungian should talk to the object relational, that should talk to the Lacanian. The primary challenge that the Palestinian psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic or psychotherapy dynamic community shares is overcoming not the siloing of within psychoanalysis, but the siloing of the apartheid state. And so that's number one.
Yeah.
To connect with you, I'm in Ramallah or in Nablus or in Bethlehem, and I'm in Nazareth or Haifa. That is the siloing off that we are trying to fight against at this point. So our priorities, at some degree, if I want to put it at a larger, more abstract level, I think a political level, that is the siloing off. And also, what is happening is as you were talking, it strikes me to think that I try to recall any example, and I could recall none, where a clinician would give a reference based on the person's practice.
Okay.
Theoretical
practice, theoretical, psychoanalytic sectarianism. To the contrary, it was always availability. Or this person, I think it fits with this person because there's all these reasonings behind it. Again, this is not to say that someone was more object relational than something else. Actually, two friends, one's a very object relational, one's a Lacanian, and they very much don't mix, but they're very good friends. Yeah. So I'm just thinking about all the referrals given out, and as you talk, it strikes me that never sort of your school comes to now they aren't clinicians, they don't go through clinical training and that, and part of the reasons that they don't do institutional training is because you live in a settler colonial state and you realize you have to actually go to a settler colonial institution in the state now known as Israel, or go abroad. Right. So that is also maybe also the resonance. The one person who is the most kind of sectarian is like Lacanian because they have someone there, because they're an analyst, so they're actually the most sectarian about all of them. And I'm not saying that that's because they're Lacanian, even though who knows. I'm saying that it's because the currency that psychoanalysis gives training. There's an investment, and so that person could be a snob for any reason, right? But again, as snobby and sectarian and emotionally, I think, sort of withholding, that stingy that person is, they cooperate with everybody and they work with everybody. So I don't really like this person, but I can see that they're very generous in as much as how they collaborate. Right? Despite the fact. So I think it's about also prioritizing Palestinian mental health.
Well, and even and to continue that, it's funny because I was thinking the exact same thing. And when you ask that question, and it's wonderful to sort of have the chance to distill it into like what actually is happening. But I think what cuts across is everybody is clear on the condition that Palestinians live under, right? With recognition about the differences. That's why, by and large, people's attention and attunement to their colleagues in Gaza, is remarkable, right? That they have this sort of, if you want to talk about mutual aid or the ways in which like we divide resources or who has to do more work, or there's this beautiful organic way in which people understand the condition of the Palestinian as being under settler colonialism, regardless of where you are, but with different lived sort of circumstances depending on where you're at in that context, right? So this referral system is also based on that, is based on access, is based on And with the recognition that all of them as clinicians are also under this condition, right? So that's why there's a sort of reaching from, and even from psychoanalysis to CBT, where, I mean, we don't spend a lot of time on people who do CBT. There's a lot of people who do CBT.
And there is this guy, Karim, who you talk about, and he changed his practice because of living conditions in Palestine, and I was interested in that. I mean, that you would adjust to what seems to you more fit to the issues you deal with.
Absolutely. And he's always included, right, in these trainings of the Palestine Global Mental Health Network, because there's an understanding about the conditions, and this Sheehi said this in the book, right? The conditions that cut across everybody, that we are all implicated in these conditions of settler colonialism. And the patient that comes in is speaking to my condition. And that is the central piece that people are very clear on that, how they understand it, how they analyze it, how they use theory to implicate it. All these things might be different, but the commonality across the board is, on the ground, there is zero confusion about what the actual systemic pressures are and where it comes from. Right. And the secondary part of that is their collective efforts, whether you're CBT or psychodynamic or psychoanalytic or Freudian or whatever, is how do we then understand immediately in front of us how these oppressive structures are linked? So, like, how does patriarchy link up with settler colonialism, right? In ways that exacerbate gender-based violence, let's say. And this was a conversation that, like, here I have to go through like one step by step to explain, systemic issues and how they're linked up, and in one conversation, because that's their lived reality. There's no confusion about it.
And just to clarify, and that doesn't mean that people don't passionately ascribe to whatever they've chosen. I was thinking about, there was a woman, for example, in Nablus, who was very, very dedicated to CBT, and other folks we know are, let's say psychodynamic light, but because they think that CBT is an important tool that at this stage. So people are passionate about what they do, but I have to say there's not. I mean, I think it's
because that woman was working alongside analysts and all that, and it wasn't like we see here, like territory. Because the territory wars.
Exactly. It's another war of territory. So it changed the way you relate to your practice, obviously.
Exactly.
Something else that I wanted to, which is connected to what you said about the psychoanalytic innocence, this sort of political paradox there is in it, which is that to be neutral, as the fundamental law of psychoanalytic listening. I mean, that it seems to me that the Palestinian situation leads to another understanding of what is neutrality in the psychoanalytic listening, which is that you can only be neutral if you're committed, and not the contrary. That neutrality would be misunderstood by seeing it as political neutrality. It's not a political neutrality. I mean, you have to be engaged politically to be neutral in your listening, which is which seems to be paradoxical. But if not, you're not in a position to listen to who is talking to you. So that's what seemed to me very interesting in your this understanding comes from your book. So I don't know, it's my
it's beautiful. It's a beautiful reading of it, and it's very Fanonian, right? So I go to Fanon's position in Black Skin, White Mask, where he's like, as a Black man, it would be a lie if I were objective, right? And that's where neutrality is confused with objectivity.
Yeah, exactly.
technically, right?
Yeah.
And I think there's a danger, like you're saying, that it's not only a political paradox, there's a danger because there's this, you're asking people to be truly psychotic in the clinical sense. When you have a example like César, where gas comes into the room, and you ask somebody to be neutral about what is causing that gas to come into the room, that's a psychotic process. Somebody to split off the gas in the room and be like objective about it.
Is it what you call regime of foreclosure? Is it to that?
I mean, neutrality can be, absolutely.
I would like to add something, but before Elias, voulez-vous dire quelque chose? I saw you light up and you were like, so I didn't want to cut you off.
I was understanding what you are saying, and so I do the link with something else, but I will have questions, but for the moment,
I go like that.
Your box lit up.
Yeah, your box lit up.
Okay.
I would just say that, I think I love your reading.
Yes.
This
great.
neutrality comes from
Commitment.
a place when, sorry?
Commitment.
Yeah.
And that, I think what we were saying is, and this relates to psychoanalysis, in a sense, the analyst has to be aware, should not be complicit in reality bending. Right? In the United States, if a Black person comes into the room, the analyst cannot be, I understand you're Black, but let's leave that at the door. Let's talk about your mother.
But that's what is done generally, right? You've seen this film, Black Psychanalysts Speak. It's exactly what Black psychanalysts speak about, that exactly what is offered to them by psychoanalytic usual training. So
we have innumerable times we've given talks and we've recounted many of our experiences, including Yoad's vignette, right? And a number of times, actually usually Black women, but not always, have come back and said, when I was under supervision, I came, and it's usually Black women with their male Black patients. I would have come back to my white supervisor, and they would say, basically, they would say, medicate them.
Really?
Or put CBT, or boom. So this weird colonial sort of like regression.
No, and that's the technical problem.
And that's the technical problem. So precisely, I mean, this idea of commitment doesn't mean that you go in and just everything the person says is true or not true, but is to understand those social conditions by which form this relationship that you have with your patient, but also which brings that person here and in the world in which we live. And I think it does come through in the book that the people we talk about are the book. We don't really talk about patients. People hear us talk about all these cases about patients. I'm not an analyst, and she's not going to practice, in the state now known as Israel or in occupied Palestine. What the people who we talk about are the clinicians, and the clinicians themselves are telling us about the settler colonial condition, and how that saturates their own personal lives and their practice.
Yes, that's why, by the way, your point is spot on about about traditional ideas of neutrality being part of a foreclosure system. Because if we foreclose even that space for people to speak to their material and political and social situation under settler colonialism, it does become an extension of the foreclosure system, because you're actively taking part in reality bending and in part of a violent arm of reality bending that invades the psychic province. Then you're the one naming what reality is in complicity with a settler colonial regime that tries to do that every day.
But it's also, by the way, I just have because I know what white people are thinking right now, right? They think like, okay, then what happens when my white Trump patient comes in, who's downtrodden and a working class person, and comes and spews all their sort of stuff, and is the analyst somehow supposed to say, oh, I understand your class world that you come in and why you're a racist? And that's where the commitment issue comes in, right?
Yeah.
Reality bending, it's not all equal.
Yeah.
Right? If you're a
Yes.
white, I mean, again, working class issues are real, and we live in a class-based society in many ways, of course, it's called capitalism. But in other ways, the way that that person is ideologically articulating certain things and then calls the analyst to participate in that ideological formation, not to be too Althusserian, you know, is different than the way you're being called by someone who's marginalized.
But can I tell you something that matches what we're saying? Is that I have seen time and again analysts far more ready to join
100%.
that person
Because the ideological hailing
than they are about Palestinians.
Because that's about, it's about identification, and
Exactly.
they're already there. They're
so
already there.
like they don't have a problem seeing the humanity in a Trump person or a neo-Nazi, where I'm just like, I don't want to be in a room with a neo-Nazi.
Yeah.
You want to analyze that's not everybody's work.
Yeah.
but Palestine shuts it down.
Yeah.
You know.
Elias, je vais pas monopoliser complètement la conversation.
Okay.
Est-ce que tu veux dire quelque chose?
Yeah, maybe I have a question as a Lebanese, because I was really impressed by your book, and in particular with what you are saying about the Palestinian culture, which is mixed with psychoanalysis. When you are talking about the sumud, and you are telling that the psychoanalysis reproduces the sumud, and I find this really interesting to see that psychoanalysis is not a theory that you can use there and there, and it has to work with what's happening on a specific territory. And what was interesting with this notion of sumud was also how the Palestinian community resists to the occupation, and the psychanalyst is part of it, and how psychanalysis and politics are linked. It's obvious in your book, because everything you said about neutrality, sometimes we don't know if psychoanalysis has a link with politics, but there we can see that it's completely obvious. But also you are talking about you as Lebanese, and I find also very moving what you were saying when you go to see the Palestinian and how they felt when you speak with them Arabic, when you speak with them Arab language, I don't know, Arabic, sorry. But as a Lebanese also, I was telling myself, okay, there the community as a resistance with Palestinian, it's obvious, but when we go to Lebanon, I think I'm a little more skeptical about the community, because I think that community is part of the problem sometimes, and psychoanalysis has to be maybe more individual for Lebanese people, maybe to cure them. I don't know, it's something that I have just like this, and that I'm asking you to see if there is another way to think also psychoanalysis in another Arabic territory very close from Palestine, which is Lebanon, but which is completely different also as a territory with a lot of conflicts between Arabs also.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So one thing we don't want to do, and I think it can come out, is that we don't want to romanticize. We don't want to romanticize the Palestinians or Arabs, nor do we want to task Palestinians or Arabs, as I said before, with any other thing that we would not task any other people with, right? There's no reason why we have to say Latinx people, all of South America, all but the Bolivarian Revolution has to unite all Latin Americans in a particular way where they all are the same, right? So we can hold, of course, we're in a French room now, so we can hold différence, right? We can hold that, right? And that's okay. Within the Palestinian people, there are 16 dialects, they say, and if you go to the north in the Galilee, it's very different from in the Khalil, Hebron. So to say political unity among the Palestinians is not to say le même, right? It's not to say everything is the same, right? But it is this, and the Lebanese, in some regards is a different
Beast.
bucket of, I don't want to tell you what. Partially that is because of colonialism.
Yeah.
Okay, this is not to blame the war and everything in Lebanon because of colonialism, but it is, there are two different topics, I think, in many ways. So I don't want to conflate them.
Yeah.
I will have to say this, where they join is that apart from the fact that the Lebanese are victims of Zionist aggression and have been, remember,
Continue.
they continue to be targets of Zionist aggression every day. They were also occupied by Israel until relatively recently for 25 years.
Yeah.
Okay, so we share that. But also what we share with the Palestinians is we share a sibling relationship. Okay, we are of the same people. Again, this is not to, say we're the same identically.
Yeah.
But we share a historic relationship that was severed specifically by Sykes-Picot and the Balfour Declaration and 1948. Okay, this is true. We go into Palestine and we heard all the stories about how people would go back and forth in one day to Beirut. And of course, my family. I have family who are Lebanese from the north who were living in Haifa for 20, 30, 40 years. I don't know what they called themselves, if they called themselves Lebanese in the 1930s or not. I don't know that. But I know that they were ejected in 1948. So I'm a Lebanese. I'll never say I'm not Lebanese, or I'll never say I'm Palestinian because my cousin was living in Haifa. But the point is that is the colonial condition in which we live. Okay. So this is something important. If we want to think about what psychoanalysis does, it thinks about, let's call it the selfhood, the psyche, the nefas, but we don't want to individualize this too much, right? We want to understand that this is a culturally informed and historically created nefas that is also dynamic, right? So when we think about sumud in the case of Palestine, we're not walking every day and, I'm saying they wake up every day and be like, okay, Muhammad, here's your lunchbox and here, take your sumud with you, right? And it doesn't also mean that being incarcerated by the Palestinians doesn't hurt.
By Israel.
I'm sorry, by the Israelis doesn't hurt. It doesn't mean that it's not humiliating to be broken down and humiliated at a checkpoint. It doesn't mean you don't get wounded or get tired or get degraded.
Yeah.
It means that sumud means it's a principle in yourself that supports one another. That despite the violence is done to you, you have this bedrock to tell you to keep going. So sumud is very important, and there has been a lot of work done, for example, in prisons where Palestinian political prisoners.
Yeah.
They create a community of support for one another, despite the violence that is done to them. So that's where it goes back to what we talk about in our text, in our book, where we really don't talk about the Israelis too much, or about Zionism, because it's not our thing. You can talk about, other people can talk about the violent imperialist apartheid state. What we're talking about is the effects the effects of the violence, but also the ways in which the Palestinians defy that violence. And that is what sumud is. It's a built-in part of your psyche this is where psychological practice, it builds up that part of your psyche, but not as an individual only, where you can be individual and part of the community, right? So we went up this idea of nafas or psyche, and even if we think about the Greek version of it, right, it means the same thing, right? It is both individual and social, right? But the individual and social is being constantly degraded upon by the apartheid settler colonial state, right? And sumud is that principle by which we uplift one another and become conscious to, right? It's that process of de-alienation, as Fanon would say, right? That is always worked upon. And for us as Lebanese, we are still incredibly alienated, my brother, incredibly alienated. We do not need individualism. The Lebanese do not need individualism. They need to connect with their communal selves beyond a sectarian configuration that they have given. right?
Inherent.
Maybe if they thought again, like people did in the 1960s and 70s about the Thawra Arabiya, the Arab Revolution, which the Arab Revolution was the Palestinian Revolution, but the Palestinian Revolution was a revolution of every Arab people to overthrow their rancid, reactionary systems of governance that they have that keep them down.
Which is our book is dedicated to.
Right, exactly.
To the Thawra al-Arabiya, right? Is لتحرير فلسطين الثورة العربية for that reason, right? And I heard in your question, I remembered my own experience in kind of coming back to Sophie's question about this book, is that being in Palestine made me love Lebanon again. Truly. It was my entry point to that. Why? I've never ascribed to Lebanese exceptionalism in both ways, both in being better or in being worse, right? Because Lebanese exceptionalism goes in both ways. There's nobody worse than us, and then we're the best people in the world. Yeah. I've never ascribed to that. But what Palestine made me see, whether it's through speaking Arabic, and that's why it became, when I say that as a Lebanese person to speak, because when you go to Lebanon, that's been stripped, right? Is that you, of course, there are people who speak Arabic, I'm not saying, but you do see a level of, yes, it's connected to identification, it's connected to whitewashing, it's connected to, you know, notre maman, it's connected to everything, whether it's French or English or whatever, right? And this is the going to Palestine made me see the alienation in Lebanon and how violent that is, but to see it not as a individual failure of the Lebanese, but as a set of logics, right? That's not to say we don't have responsibility as but I think that's part of why we speak about a responsibility as a Lebanese person, or why I say I'm Arab Lebanese, never just Lebanese, because that's a political position that means something in the Arab world. To say I'm not identifying with a Lebanese exceptionalism that sets us apart from all Arabs, that we have a certain history or you know, cosmopolitanism, all the bullshit that is said about Lebanon. But it really was Palestine. That was my entry point to that, right? As a Lebanese dedicated to the liberation of Palestine, it allowed me to link up the liberation of the rest of the Arab world, and Lebanon being a central part of that, right? And I speak about this in different ways when you see the topography of Palestine and how moving and crushing at the same time it was to me to recognize the rocks, the shrubbery, the everything. It looks like Lebanon. It looks like Lebanon. There's something that lives inside of us, both in terms of our relationality, but in terms of what you see that a settler can't see, because they build these disgusting buildings over it that have no place being in the Middle East, so to speak, look nothing like of that place. But the rocks are still there that will carry Lebanon to Palestine, that the untrained eye, the non-Indigenous eye, is not going to see in the same way, right? But it really, this is the point. So to resist this sort of individual, even though I completely sympathize with your position, and I understand where it comes from. As a Lebanese, I understand where your question comes from. And to say that part of the political commitment is to resist resist the structures that would tell us that Lebanon is different in any way, right? That's not to say there aren't specificities, right? Like the sectarian system is very specific in a different way than it is in Palestine, because there is sectarianism also all over the Arab world. But that feels like a violent imposition to set us apart in that way. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So maybe a last question, which is linked also to Lebanon and to Palestine. I've seen a documentary many years ago, which the title was "Would You Have Sex with an Arab?" And it's about someone asking Israeli people if it's possible for them to have sex with an Arab, and it's a complete taboo. And and I was asking myself if also Glissant, the hybridity, these notions of hybridity can be also one of your reference, or do you think that it's not possible anyway to think the possibility of mixing also people coming from different communities, because we don't hear about this anymore in between Israeli people and Palestinians, and it's also maybe now a taboo in Lebanon between different religions, where it's difficult to get married with someone coming from another community, because now it's more sectarian than it was before. And I was asking myself, because I'm also in a Deleuze-Guattarian journal, where these notions of hybridity is very important, and I was asking myself why I haven't seen that in your book, and I was asking also this question about how can you mix also different cultures, because I'm also French, even if I'm a Lebanese and an Arab, but I'm also French, and there are a lot of conflicts between all these different parts of myself.
Mm-hmm.
You've been reading Glissant again recently, a lot.
Okay, so you want me to handle this one?
Yeah, you can start.
All right.
Yeah.
So I think what you are getting at is an important tripwire in our use of and our engagement with theory.
Yeah.
Right? So first thing is, would you have sex with an Arab? I probably know, like, they really want everyone to say yes, but the paradigm itself is so violent to me.
Yeah.
It's so offensive, sexist, heteronormative, and just
Naturalizing, it's essentializing, it's just horrible.
It's terrible. But it speaks to the way we approach hybridity. And the way hybridity is weaponized.
Yeah.
Right? Hybridity is one thing, and it stands in contrast to, authenticity, to ideas of authenticity.
Yeah.
And so we can
purity too.
Big pardon?
Purity, origin, and all this.
Exactly. So we can. So what happens is we're positioned between this binary immediately when you think about hybridity, right? So when hybridity becomes currency in the 1990s, really, say with Homi Bhabha, or what he's trying to do is actually dismantle a binary, right?
Yeah.
To understand about contamination, right, in the Derridian sense, right? A decentering of a binary, which is also Deleuze, right, and Guattari, right? But on the other hand, I think what I love about Deleuze and Guattari always is that despite the complexity and the epistemological critique that they're launching always, that politics never gets lost, right? Politics never gets lost. That's why Deleuze was one of the few French theorists that were pro-Palestinian.
Yeah.
Truly, right?
Yeah.
So I think the idea of hybridity is an incredibly important analytic to when we think about identities, to fight against these ideas of purity and authenticity. But it also can be weaponized.
Yeah.
Right? Well, why don't we all just have sex and just make these mulatto babies, right? But because what happens is there's hybridity and then there's settler colonialism. And settler colonialism means that the settler doesn't only kill off the indigenous people. The settler kills off the indigenous people and calls themselves native. They call themselves the indigenous. So then now we're going to have this, all Israelis, the nice Israelis, they look at us, oh, we're neighbors. We're neighbors. It's the government. No, you're a settler. You are a settler. Israelis are settlers. That's not authenticity, and that's not a reactionary. That is fact. That is, if we're going to talk about Lacan, the kernel of material reality that is unbendable. Were they born there because of what, and after the post-Nakba, okay, fine. But in the end, Israel is a settler colonial state. And when you were asked to be hybridized, you don't ask to be hybridized. You asked to be legitimized. And that's, so we're about hybridity. I mean, and we're about interconfessional, not because what that does is that deconstructs, that unwinds these social constructs that are violent constructs. But on the other hand, hybridity can be weaponized, right? If it's not used responsibly. And that's where theory has a problem, right? Theory has a problem because in psychoanalysis or in whatever, it tends to be too smart for itself and participate in reality bending and participate in factual, unbendable truths like the state of Israel is a settler colonial state. It is. Now you can accept it, it's in UN and the United States is a settler colonial state. We know that, everybody knows that. Canada, we know that. New Zealand, Australia, no one says that they're not settler colonial states. They have these large discourses about what happened to the natives, but no one denies that. Right? So I think for us to think about hybridity in the context of Palestine is getting ahead of ourselves. Let's repatriate the Palestinians. Let the Palestinians come back. We don't have a problem with hybridity, they do. Because they don't want to live in a truly democratic state that would allow hybridity. They want to maintain racial superiority.
And this is from an intersectarian marriage, Lebanese marriage. But there's nothing really to follow up except to again go back to this point about the violence as a question, which, and it gets back to psychoanalytically when I say there's a technical problem, there's a deflection there already, because when you ask, you know, do you want to have sex with an Arab? And that's to an Israeli, you're already imagining the pure Israeli, and that is not a Palestinian, because there are Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, but you're not asking, you're assuming there's an Israeli is a Jewish person, and saying Arab means you're not saying Palestinian, right? You're already imagining who an Israeli is and who a non-Israeli is, and who Palestinian is not. You're not allowed to say Palestinian, you're saying Arab, right? It also is a deflection from the conditions, and this is your point about settler colonialism, from the conditions that would disallow us from intermarrying, whether that's in Lebanon from a sectarian perspective or from a settler colonial perspective. I mean, this is a great question right now, because Israel just passed a law where people who are Israeli citizens, Palestinians, cannot marry somebody from West Bank or Gaza or even from diaspora, because they're not allowed to get Israeli citizenship. So it's already telling us this, your point of they have the problem, because they're worried about the demographic problem of what it is, and therefore they're not a democratic state, because you can't be an ethno-theocratic state and democratic at the same time. But it's already embedded, the deflection is already embedded in, because it takes away from the social, the political, and the economic reasons why people can't intermarry, right? And those structures, whether that's patriarchy or, you know, to get inheritance, which is a gender issue, and who gets, right? All these sorts of issues are the real issue. And instead it gets distilled into this one problem, then and always becomes the backwardness of the Arabs that you can't modernize, and that's why we can't intermarry. If you would just fix your patriarchy problem, then maybe we've been told a million times. But I think that's the piece of who are we imagining when we ask this question, and it tells on itself already.
Right. Yeah. It's easier to imagine a hybrid world in many ways than just dismantling settler colonialism.
Yeah.
So hybridity, I think we should think about hybridity after we think about imagine a world without settler colonialism.
It's very interesting the way you show the false alternative hybridity can be in comparison to a decolonial, a real decolonial politics. And yeah, I agree with you on that. Thank you very much, Lara and Stefan, for giving us this possibility to foresee what can be a decolonial psychoanalysis, and even what it already is, thanks to you and to your book. So I'm looking forward to read your next work that direction, and because it's a truly really inspiring reading, and everyone who has read it around me has been really impressed by it. So I really wanted to have the opportunity to make it known to more people, and you know, we are going to speak about it in French too, so it will give it given access to it to even more people. So yeah, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you both.
And thank you, yes, thank you for both of you. Hopefully we will get to meet you all in person, and next time have our conversation in French.
Yes, and Palestine will be free.